Well, hello, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Kristen Abrams. I'm the Chief Program Officer at the McCain Institute and have the privilege of working with all of my colleagues that you've seen here today. I'm really excited for this conversation, though, and Ian is a friend and someone I could spend hours talking to. So hopefully, this will be an engaging conversation. I know it will be for me, but hopefully for all of you as well. My background is in international human rights, and I've spent the last 10 years focused specifically on human trafficking and forced labor. And it's a topic that isn't always explored in conversations like this. I think we talk about human rights in general, we'll talk about atrocities committed by China or by Russia in very generic terms. And forced labor is one of those topics that I think really can bring it home. And hopefully, we will make this feel very real for Americans. It's not something that I see happening in a lot of policy conversations in Washington. So Ian is the director of the Outlaw Ocean Project. He is a journalist, a longtime New York Times journalist, has done some groundbreaking investigations into a really wide range of topics focused on human rights and environmental abuses. Most recently, actually, I shouldn't say most recently because I know he's doing a lot of other things, but for several years, he and his team did what became a really landmark investigation into human rights and environmental abuse on the high seas. And he was able to uncover a link to China and to the CCP, not just in the territorial waters around China or nearby the South China Ocean, but frankly, globally. And so that's really where I want to start. I did not do justice to what that investigation was. Can you give us a snapshot of the findings and particularly connect it to the US? Like, what does this mean for the folks sitting here in the room?
Sure. Thanks for having me. So the investigation that we did was attempting to look at one product, namely seafood, and take a sort of global look at it. Quickly, it became apparent that China is a sort of choke point for this product in two real ways. One is on the water, and the other is on land. And the thought was huge amounts of this product is disseminated around the world as routed through China, partially because China's distant water fishing fleet, so those are the vessels that are in international waters or foreign waters, is bigger by a factor of 3 than any other fleet. And then partially because on land, the processing capacity for seafood, which is a labor-intensive, dirty, difficult manufacturing industry, if you will, that has been outsourced largely to China, is bigger than anywhere else. And so that means, to your US point, large amounts of seafood that ends up eaten in the US or Canada or Europe is often caught even by those ships from those places, but then sent to China for processing and sent back to the end consumer. So for all these reasons, we thought, well, let's take a really hard look at China. The last reason was the standard one, which is China's interesting because it's journalistically interesting because it's so opaque and it's just difficult and seemed like a good target for that reason. The goal was to look again into key places on land and on the water in a bunch of places. And we focused on the squid fleet. And the squid fleet, more than the tuna fleet or fish meal fleet, more ships, more human beings working on them, and they're in more distant waters. So that means they're at sea longer than a lot of other vessels, and that's a big risk indicator of human rights and labor concerns. And over the course of 4 years, looked at and boarded a bunch of Chinese vessels in high seas Falkland Islands, high seas Galapagos, sea border with North Korea, and coast of West Africa. And these are all places where there are large clusters of Chinese squid vessels. And and what we found there was just brutal conditions, the standard sort of problems you find in distant water fishing fleets from a labor perspective. So a lot of bamboozlement and human trafficking in the form of pretty corrupt contracts. Before COVID, it was largely foreign crews, Filipinos, Indonesians. So Chinese officers, usually a 40-man crew, maybe 10 Chinese officers, the rest foreign crew. But after COVID, it was tough to move workers around. So these were mostly inland Chinese, which might as well be foreign workers. because they're equally clueless, frankly, about the sort of tricks of the trade that more coastal, port-based workers know when it comes to fishing. And then on land, so we found by boarding and by doing years of interviews, a lot of violence, a lot of debt bondage, a lot of captivity, a lot of death by neglect. So beriberi is a certain disease from malnutrition that is easily preventable and reversible, but common on these vessels. Then on land, whole other difficult nut to crack journalistically. Initially, we're trying to figure out, okay, I'm not going to be able to get a visa into China. I can't report in China. But how could we do it remotely? How can we get eyes into the factories? How can we sort of connect the supply chain dots that prove that this seafood is coming back to the U.S.? These are all challenges. Started out by looking for various categories of forced labor, child labor, prison labor, others, and quickly began discovering North Korean and Uyghur workers. Uyghur is really shocking. Xinjiang is the most landlocked place on the planet, so you wouldn't expect there to be a seafood tie, but post-COVID, the government was moving thousands of Uyghur workers from Xinjiang to Shandong, to the coast. So documenting that and proving that these workers who are categorically defined as captive forced labor were in factories that were exporting to the U.S. was one big effort. And then the second effort was the same basic process, but documenting the presence of large numbers of North Korean workers, mostly women, many of them sexually abused, in factories in a different area of China that also was exporting to the U.S.
You know the stat better than I do. Will you share, so where did you see these products ending up in the U.S.? There are some that I'm remembering that were pretty interesting.
Yeah, I mean, everywhere is the simple answer. I mean, the ubiquity of the inflow of these plants. There were 15 main huge plants that were the most systematically involved in the processing of seafood that was ending up in the U.S. Canada was also a huge recipient as well. But it's all ending up in the standard, Walmart and Whole Foods supermarkets, but also some of it being routed to major restaurant chains and, large intermediary players like Cisco, who are the kind of big companies, the largest food company in the world, Cisco, the supplier of most of the seafood that's served in congressional cafeterias and public schools and federal prisons, is Cisco. And Cisco was heavily tainted by this forced labor. And that was a great target for us journalistically because it has not just the added, kind of brand reputation pressure point, but it has the taxpayer money going into it pressure point.
And I think there's also, this is a room of Washington-based folks, many working in policy. And when we were doing advocacy around this issue, often I would be talking to people and they say, well, what can the government do? And I'm saying, well, the government is spending money buying these products and then serving them in our nation's school and on military bases and in cafeterias. So I think it's easy to say that's a problem for somewhere else. And the reality is that is a problem that is happening every day here at home. So I know your investigation uncovered atrocities being committed by the CCP. Ian and I have been exchanging emails in preparation for this panel, and I, although now work on all the programs, still have very much a connection into the forced labor issue set. And just recently, I've started hearing from more than one person who said, okay, so we've been talking about forced labor in the seafood industry with a particular link to China, but where else? Are there other countries that may also be behaving in a similar way? And we know that we've heard, if you've been here all day, whether it's Autocracies Inc. or Alliance of Autocracies or group of revisionist autocracies are using the same playbook. And so the question I got was, is the Russian government involved in this? And so I'm starting to get some more specific data, and I'm curious, kind of you just to opine on this. Do you think that we have this similar kind of involvement from Russia using whether it's Uyghur labor on land. I also heard North Korean labor, which is what you find in China. Obviously, we now know there are North Koreans fighting in Ukraine, so not too far of a link to think that they may also be part of the Russian seafood industry as well. And so then the question would be, have you heard this? And then second, so do you have the same concerns about Russian products being imported into the US? And do we need to be talking to Congress about a Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act as it relates to Russia as well?
Yeah, let me go in reverse order. So I think, it's pretty well established that Russian caught seafood is ending up in the U.S. market, most often routed through China and sort of relabeled as such, which sometimes gets around intended barriers and anemic enforcement of whatever we have. So that's proven. How to solve it, different matter, but there's a strong lobby and kind of deep-pocketed industry that's American industry that's very interested in this, namely the Alaskan fishery and pollock and cod, and so that means you've got a muscular, well-financed industry.
You mean that in not a harmful way in this situation?
No. I mean, I mean it in a journalistically agnostic way.
Deep-pocketed lobby, and you automatically think, not the one
but
we
I
want
also,
to be on the side of.
I'm not going to sugarcoat it either. I mean, they have vested interests, and they're going to promote certain agendas that benefit them for financial reasons, not because they're specifically sympathetic to human rights. So just as a pure journalist, I'll just say, let's be sober about who's really going to probably ramp this up. For me, that's great because then I can get really good stories on issues that I care about, but also very aware of who might be eager to push these stories. And that's the Alaskan fishery industry. Fine. But it's a real issue. It's not a made-up issue. And Russian illegally caught fish is ending up through China most often in the U.S. market. Now, seafood, well, to your other question, do I wonder and feel confident that there's probably various forms of forced labor in the Russian industry? For sure. The question I'd be interested in is which type. So North Korean, good theory. Uyghur, unlikely. Child, probably. Kind of captured by Western definitions in factories or on ships, probably. I wouldn't be shocked at all if there was prison labor on vessels. So if I were kind of going to take on the Russian forced labor story, again, trying to report outside, I'd probably be looking for open source intelligence that tells me something about those categories. I've never heard of many other types of foreign labor working on Russian ships, but I'm not sure. I've just never looked at it. So the common are Filipino, Indonesian. I don't think many of those folks are on these ships, but there could be other foreigners that are on the ships. I do think it is a legitimate, no matter the industry or non-industry that's pushing it, opportunity to push for better transparency of illegal fishing and human rights concerns on the Russian issue, because it's a great test case to see how stuff getting routed through China might be blocked.
Yeah, and you just brought up what was going to be my next question. The panel just before us, which we caught the end of, but I've had the privilege of getting a preview of what that conversation was about, related to human rights defenders, and particularly those that are working on environmental defense. And in your reporting, my background is looking more at the social issues, and so the labor and forced labor issues. But you found a clear link between environmental degradation and illegal fishing happening on these vessels, and also labor issues. And I'm curious if you can explore whether you think that link was unusual to the China situation, or is that something that you would expect to find globally? And do we need to then link up in our policy solutions people working on environmental issues and on labor issues?
Yes. So again, in reverse order, I think the policy approach that makes sense. It's difficult in the siloed nature of U.S. government, but the policy approach is a whole government approach that would say, okay, the U.S. government might want to turn and look at the market players, especially those in our own country, and say, okay, if you want to sell to Uncle Sam, if you want to sell to the U.S. market, then you have to comply with a more holistic look at various forms of illegality, be it human rights or labor or whatever, and you have to, and the U.S. government could set a very high bar on purchasing alone without even need for Congress, just purchasing decisions. But your first question, I think you do need to remind me your first question. I before that one.
It was just about the link between.
Yeah. Right. So yes, there's a really strong kind of body of proof now that the same vessels and the same parent companies and usually the same countries are engaged in the various categories of illegality, usually in the IUU or illegal fishing space. That's incursions. So single companies or countries are routinely allowing their vessels to go into Argentinian waters, Ecuadorian waters when they're not allowed to. Other illegal forms or gear that you're not, fishing gear that you're not supposed to use for various environmental reasons. Those are the same vessels that have the most brutal labor conditions, because at the end of the day, these are all cost-saving tactics. And so to keep a worker on board against their will for 6 extra months and to not pay them what you promised them is a way to drive down the cost. And then to go into a marine protected area and fish there when you're not supposed to is another way to drive down your costs.
Well, and I'll pick up on that point, the cost point. I would like for every person in this room or every stakeholder I talk to be opposed to forced labor or human rights abuse for moral reasons. And I think many people are. But the reality is, if you're a businessman, a company, there's some real strong market incentives to be using forced labor in certain places. And if you are the company who's not using forced labor, you're looking around, you're looking at the US government and saying, and not just the US government, other governments, and saying, like, can you do something about this guy? Because he's driving down costs, he's using free labor. I now just can't compete. So some of our strongest partners have been the businesses that aren't using, forced or coerced labor, not just in seafood, but in many other industries that have higher than others prevalence of forced labor. So, we could talk about the policy solutions that Congress, and I think a lot of the DC focus is on that. But I am interested in your perspective on what are those market incentives. You've engaged companies. So after your reporting, I know you put a lot of information out and said, we're going to go directly to companies. We're going to say, this is what we found. Like, what's your response? And so I'm curious if you can share a little bit more about those conversations that you had directly with companies. And are there things, we know that there are some policies. We've talked about that. Olivia earlier talked about the Weaker Forced Labor Prevention Act and better enforcement of that. There are some trade mechanisms that could be better enforced. There are sanctions that we could do a better job, global Magnitsky. But talk a little bit more about the market side of the equation.
Yeah, I mean, your last citations, Customs and Border, Magnitsky, UFLPA, CATSA for North Koreans, I was going to were my go-to, but you removed it. No. I think that's good. You already did that work. Those are viable tools that, depending on the political kind of climate, there's an unspoken mandate to really go after them or not, and those are very powerful tools that can be used more or less, and can have huge market impact. And I think all of them could be used a lot more. On the purely market side, aside from Uncle Sam as a buyer, right, there's also the ability for the U.S. government and Congress in particular, to muscularly shame industry players into cleaning up their tracking of their own product. So letters from Congress or agencies asking these companies to answer questions that they can just ignore me when I ask, which is typically what they do. They won't ignore those folks, most likely. And those made public start moving the industry and the market. And I think that is another place hopefully we'll see kick up soon, pressing the big players. And then there are kind of the bigger players, Cisco, Walmart, these huge players. If you can get a couple of them to move, the rest of the market will move, and U.S. government can probably get them to move. There are things in the pipeline that you didn't mention, like SIMP, seafood import monitoring, protocol, which requires companies, if they're going to enter the U.S. market, to document the extent of their tracking, and the bar is supposed to go up for those as well, which will put more pressure on companies to not say, sort of plausible deniability, like, look, we're in China and we can only ask certain questions at the factory, and we have to call ahead before we do an inspection and let them know when we're coming. But we are certifying that plant. I think hopefully those norms in the industry will change, whereas that's not certification if you're calling ahead. They know you're coming and they're going to move the Uyghurs or North Koreans off-site. So those are the sorts of changes I'd hope.
We've long talked about the failure of the so-called social audit in a place like China, which does not work. Okay, well, I have really enjoyed this conversation. We are unfortunately out of time. Thank you. Please come back. We could do this again on a range of topics, but please join me in thanking Ian Urbina.
Thank you.